Okay, good afternoon and welcome to today's RGU Knowledge Bites for Business webinar. And today we are addressing Scope 3 emissions through effective supply chain management. My name is Neil Farman and I am the Net Zero Business Development Manager here at Robert Gordon University. So just before we get started with the discussion, just want to briefly draw your attention to the housekeeping slide. So if I could ask Adekunle to move to the next slide for me, please. So obviously today's webinar will be recorded, so if everyone could keep their microphones muted and cameras switched off, that would be great. However, we will be having a Q&A session at the end, so please do throughout the webinar pop your questions into the Q&A function just at the bottom of the screen there. We'll get through as many as we can at the end of the discussion. Over the past year, our Knowledge Bites for Business webinars have considered critical current and future challenges across a number of industries. And with COP26 fast approaching, our experts are now tackling some of the key barriers in the transition towards net zero with our Runway to COP26 Knowledge Bites for Business mini-series. Taking stock of your business's Scope 3 carbon emissions is a key stage in net zero planning. But how can your business both assess and reduce carbon emissions when they're indirect? So today we are joined by RGU Aberdeen Business School experts Adekunle and Osobajo, who will provide an overview of what Scope 3 emissions actually are and provide examples for how businesses can address these. So without any further ado, over to you, Yomi.
Thank you, Neil. Good afternoon, everybody, and I hope our afternoon has been going on fine. So like Neil said, the scope or focus of today's presentation is on Scope 3 emissions, creating a decarbonization strategy. However, before we go specifically into Scope 3, I will be giving generic overview of emissions and some statistics about climate change before my colleague Adekunle actually goes through a project that was just completed in order to show for the strategy we are trying to put forth today. Yeah, next slide, please. Probably a question to ask everyone online today, of which I'm not expecting an answer anyway, is to ask us why we have found ourselves in the position or current position we are today regarding emissions and climate change. Looking at the current slides, a couple of issues has been identified alongside with their resultant effects of our actions as an organization and individuals and inactions. Taking, for example, individuals and organizations. These has been identified as the major or biggest responsible for the human impact on the environment. From an organization's point of view, overconsumption could come along the way of oversized offices, the overcast vehicles that we make use within our organizations. All these are detrimental to the environment. It's so interesting actually to see the guiding report that the natural resources that we have around us, like water, like oil, gas, coal, are even under severe pressure from our current rate of consumptions. Looking back as far as 5-6 years ago, this is not the scenario. It's just to let us understand the fact that we are actually stripping the environment of the natural resources. So again, in the past decades, if we consider sectors or industries such as the fashion industry, you look at the agriculture, the manufacturing, or the mobile, you will realize that these industries have actually gone to the level of producing things that people that cannot even afford. And now I'm looking at the concept of overproduction. If we look at it from the point of view of supply being more than demand, we will realize that this action often results in things such as waste generation, factories being closed down and workers being laid off. All these put together have actually resulted in endless cycle of poverty and waste, which also contributes to global warming. We can actually link this attitude of overconsumption, overproduction, or mass production to changes in lifestyle, actually. So with this, we can take more or talk more about the way organizations source for their materials, the way you as organization representative, you source for your materials, the way you design your end product to be an appealing product to customers also influences the global warming and climate change at large. Looking on the current slide and in support of the discussion so far, the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, actually came up with a study that looks into the trends of global temperature and the average level of sea rise. And they came to a conclusion that due to our attitude of behavior, we are actually living and experiencing the consequences of climate change already. And of course, there is no doubt about that. If you look around us, what is happening around the globe, you will realize that we have intense activities going on with respect to hurricane, the flood, the downpour, or the winter storms all around the globe. So their findings, the IPCC findings, looking at this graph, actually shows that, looking at the first graph, that in the last almost 6 to 5 decades, since 1970, the global average temperature has actually been rising at the rate of 1.7 degrees Celsius, which is not actually good for us. Yes, this is generic. We are still coming back to the point of view of looking at it from the perspective of organization, which Adekunle will actually give us a better scenario about. Also, a review of the actions or timelines. Can you go to the next slide, please? A review of the timeline by the IPCC on climate change actually raised significant concern about what is going on at the moment. It is argued by the IPCC that what we've actually created, both individuals and organizations, is actually irreversible. However, from the scientist point of view and practitioner point of view, we are saying that it is actually possible to reverse this only if we can cut down our global emission. That will be possible for us to do. So in other way, what we're trying to say today is we all have a role to play in cutting down the global emission, in combating or limiting the impact of global climate change on our environment. So with this background, that takes me to the next slide. Looking at this background, we want to summarize to say, with respect to organization, emission has been categorized into 3 forms. We have the scope 1 emission, we have the scope 2 emission, and we have the scope 3 emission. So when we talk about the scope 1 emission, these are the emissions that could directly be linked to us. As organizations, we have direct control on these emissions. Talking about scope 2 emission is actually classified as indirect, but I think there is an aspect of direct influence on it because this has to do with the kind of electricity we purchase, the kind of steam, heat, and cooling system. So in as much we say this scope 2 is indirect, we as organization, we have an aspect of it that we could influence. For example, we could determine the source that these emissions are coming from before we purchase them. And looking at scope 3 emission, which is purely indirect, these are the emissions that actually occurs within an organization's value chain, the entire supply chain. So in essence, what we are saying here is, for your supplier, what are scope 1 and scope 2 emissions for your supplier will be your own scope 3 emissions because you don't have any control on these emissions. Next stage, please. So this screen or this slide actually gives us an overview of what each of these emissions actually comprises. So it is often observed that most organizations tend to focus on scope 1 and scope 2 emission, whereby they have more direct control. Yes, that is true. Whereas the scope 3 emission, which is the largest source of companies' emission, is often forgotten. In fact, according to research, it has been proven that 40% of global emission actually occurs through the scope 3 emission. So the question is, what are we doing as organization to influence this rate of emission? So there is a growing need for us to reduce the global emission through giving attention to scope 3 emission in our organization or our entire supply chain or value chain. So my colleague Adekunle will be looking at a typical example of a project recently completed that helped an organization to look at their scope 3 emission, ways to reduce emission through the scope 3. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oluyomi, for that explanation. To link the previous discussion by Oluyomi to what I will present, I will just to gauge your opinion using some poll questions about scope 3 and scope 2 emissions. So if you can quickly answer yes or no for these two questions, that will help us. So thank you very much. If you look at the result, I hope you can see the result. If you look at the result, we'll discover that at this present time, about 60% of us agree that we have realistic targets to reduce our scope 1 and scope 2 emissions by 2030. And looking at the question 2, only about 40% agrees that they have ambitious action plans to monitor and reduce their scope 3 emissions. And that is where the problem is. We may have realistic targets to reduce scope 1 and scope 2, but scope 3 is equally important, and many organizations are struggling to map and measure their scope 3 emissions. And that will be the basis of our discussion over the next 15 or 20 minutes. So to put the last questions into perspective, let's look at the concept of supply chain. If we understand how our supply chain works, we discover that our supply chain involves the flow of information resources, especially raw materials from point A to point B. And if you look at the graph on the left-hand side, that's how complex our supply chain is. While the chart on the right-hand side shows us our own operation, we take resources and we use these resources, we transform these resources to satisfy our customers. As Dr. Oluyomi has already explained, overconsumption of resources leads to waste. We have waste of time, waste of energy, waste of heat, solid waste. So how can we make our supply chain sustainable? So if we put this operation at the right-hand side into the supply chain of the left-hand side, you discover how complex your supply chain is. For example, to align the complexity of supply chain, RGU alone has more than 1,000 suppliers and contractors with over 16,000 students and more than 691 academic staff and 905 professional and support staff. So to map their carbon emission scope according to scope 3 emissions concerning these stakeholders or the complexity of their supply chain, you discover that it's practically impossible or challenging for many organizations to undertake. So what are the key challenges? We look at the complexity of supply chain, but what are the challenges in mapping our scope 3 emissions? One of the issues that we've recognized is the lack of collaboration. If you look at how complex our supply chain is, we lack collaboration. We are not collaborating effectively the way we should, and there's lack of integration from upstream to downstream of your supply chain. If there's no integration, then there won't be opportunity to trace your supply chain and for supply chain to be feasible. And also, technology challenge is one of the issues facing organizations when mapping or measuring their carbon or scope 3 emissions. Also, there's no reliable data, and when this data is available, they are often poor and very difficult to compare. So, if you synthesize all these arguments together, the most challenging area for organization is how to engage their suppliers in order for them to map their scope 3 emissions effectively. So what are the key considerations? We've talked about challenges. We've talked about how complex the supply chain can be. Before we talk about key consideration when mapping or measuring your scope 3 emissions, you should understand that scope 1 and scope 2 of your suppliers will automatically be your scope 3 emissions. So if you can collaborate effectively with your suppliers, you understand the emissions, that is scope 1 and scope 2 emissions of your suppliers, you'll be able to map and measure your scope 3 emissions effectively. So to do that, we have certain considerations that we've identified. One is trust. If there's trust in your supply chain across the value chain, you'll be able to collaborate effectively. You'll be able to share knowledge. You'll be able to share data. Also, you need to understand your distribution networks. How are you transferring your product or your service from point A to point B? How sustainable is your distribution network? How are you sourcing your product? How are you sourcing your raw materials? Are you sourcing locally, or you are looking abroad, or you outsource your services, your products, or your raw materials? Another thing that you need to take into consideration is effective business model. And one business model that we've been able to identify is circular economy. People talk about the circular economy differently, but there's no clarity for businesses to undertake or to design what a circular economy really entails and how to implement circular economy. And most importantly, you need to propose a science-based target. We will discuss about science-based targets later in this presentation. So we've understood what key challenges are. We've talked about key considerations. We've explained complexity of our supply chain. So how can we respond at the required speed and scale? For you to respond at the required speed and scale, you need supply chain vision. Remember, we are not talking about organization vision here. We're talking about supply chain vision, which means there should be a shared common understanding among or between the players across the supply chain. So your supply chain should have a vision. Also, you need to identify a champion or champions from your organization and across the supply chain. Why is the champion important? Our research has shown that organizations that have champions, especially green champions, they perform effectively in their sustainability initiative. Also, you need to set goals and targets, and your goals and targets must be based on SBTI, that is Science-Based Target Initiative's recommendation. And along with your goals and targets, you need realistic commitment. Without commitment, it will be very difficult to embed actions. And for you to embed actions, you need effective business model. We will talk about the business model that we propose later in this presentation. So again, we talk about science-based target initiative. So for you to respond at the required speed and scale, you need to set targets. So the target is science-based because it aligns with the current evidence, that is actions to limit the CO2 emissions or green gas emissions well below 2 degrees Celsius and above pre-industrial levels. And your commitment, that is your effort, should limit the warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. So by the time you set these targets, the target must be approved or validated by SBTI. And also, you need a baseline measure and benchmark. We all know that the year 2002 has been a case study. It was unprecedented year. So you may not use that as a baseline. You may look further, maybe 2019, 2018, to establish your benchmark. And you'll be able to evaluate your performance based on your baseline measure. And also because there are different approaches and processes in evaluating your greenhouse gas emissions regarding scope 3 emissions. You need to evaluate your process and approach, whether it's the right one for your organization, because depending on the size of your supply chain and depending on the location of your organization. So you may want to use a method such as activity-based method, which has to do with your operations and your activities. On the other hand, you may look at your financial statement, your procurement record, and look at your spend, your annual spend, and use that assessment to evaluate your scope 3 emissions. And also you need to develop actions. Your actions will be based on business model that you are proposing for your organization and across the entire value chain. So to summarize how you can respond at the required speed and scale, we've identified 3 key themes that can help your organization across its value chain. One is digital technology. The second one is supply chain, which is value chain. And the third one is your business strategy or business model. Regarding technology, you can use artificial intelligence, you can use data analytics, cloud computing, and Internet of Things to demonstrate the potential of technology. For example, Robert Goddard University installed 19 wireless urinals, and this saves about 4 million liters of water every year. That is potential of technology. So with development or advancement in technology, you can actually meet your scope 3 emissions by reducing your activities, the consequences of your activities on the environment. The second approach is supply chain. You can look at your procurement strategy. You can look at how you distribute your goods and services. You can look at your sourcing strategy and also collaboration. All this will lead to your supply chain feasibility and traceability. To utilize the power of your supply chain, you can use tools like Krajik metrics or Pareto analysis to segment your customers or your suppliers and your product and services as well. So you'll be able to understand the area of your business that is generating high or higher emissions. Also, you need innovation, which has to do with your business strategies. We've talked about circular economy previously, but I will be focusing on sharing, the idea of renting, and the growth. Also, your business model must be demand driven. If your business model is demand driven, which means you are not consuming excess resources, you are not producing excess products than what demand can consume. So to synthesize everything, you need a lean and agile supply chain for you to be responsive and effective across the entire value chain. So to highlight what we've been discussing so far, we use a case which has to do with assets over ownership. This is instigated by a publication with other professors in England. We look at 5 different cases of library of things. The idea is about library of things. The idea is to have a peer-to-peer sharing of items or materials or resources rather than purchasing or owning items. With this concept, you'll be able to extend the useful life of products and divert materials or resources from landfill. And as we know, many businesses are adopting this concept at the moment across different sectors. Even in your own organization, you may discover that you are currently using this approach, but you may not be able to commercialize it due to different challenges inherent in that business model. And the project we undertook recently was designed to look at these challenges and how businesses can overcome these challenges. So the library of things concept work like a normal library, But rather than renting books, you'll be renting resources or materials that you can use for your operations. So the project that we executed, the goal is to reduce overconsumption of resources. Dr. Osobajo has already explained that overconsumption of resources is one of the challenges we have in this recent time. Also, one of the goals is to divert useful materials from landfills and to extend the useful life of tools and equipment. Also, it provides access to tools at the community level. So rather than buying tools, spending money on tools that you will use once and you will not use again maybe in 4, 5, 6 months time, you just have access, you hire tools, use for your project and return tools back to the platform. So based on that business model, what are the key issues associated with it? One of it is the lack of collaboration, lack of knowledge or awareness about the idea of concept of things, norms and beliefs, our mindset about consuming rather than having access to materials or resources. Also, lack of open innovation is one of the key issues associated with the library of things concept. So for us to design a service operation for the organization that we work with on this project, firstly, we look at their customer proposition. So that gives us an insight on how to design a process model for them. So to understand their customer proposition, we conducted a market research by seeking the opinion or views of their customers, both the current users and non-users. Also, we explore their profit formula. That is how they will take their product from point A to point B, which is the route to the market. So we propose a subscription base per item for the organization. And also we explore the service or product delivery because they have to be sustainable across the entire process. So we look at how they can deliver their product to their customers or their consumers. To understand whether the service operation will be sustainable or effective for this organization, we try to explore their key resources, both tangible and intangible resources. If you go back to my previous slide on process model, you will see that organizations take resources from point A, transform these resources, and convert these resources to useful products or services to their customers. So for them to do that effectively, they need to understand their internal capabilities. If they are not capable to do that internally, it may defeat the purpose or the goals of the service operation. So based on the previous slide and based on our consumer engagement or market research, we proposed a hub and spoke model for this organization. And the hub and spoke model that we propose has 3 service points and a central location. So the central location will be pickup and delivery point for customers. So they will still run a central location. But by the time we look at their internal capabilities, we came up with some criteria. We look at their sourcing strategy, their capacity, how they can manage their inventory, the attributes of their customers, and the proximity and the accessibility of these 3, 4 locations. And also we look at the logistics and delivery system that is available currently in the city. So based on this criteria, we discovered that it will be too complex for this organization because of their size, location, and capabilities to manage 4 different locations. And the management of these 4 different locations will not be sustainable and will contribute or increase their carbon emissions. So we revised the service operations model and come up with 2 spokes and only 1 hub. But the central hub will serve as service point and the central location as well. And that will offer opportunities for this organization to conduct training, to map their carbon emissions, and to understand their suppliers and their users more.
Hi,
And then
everyone. Oh, Adekunle, I'm sorry, we lost you there for a few seconds. So you might just need to go back slightly.
Yeah, you mean this slide? Hello, Claire.
Yes, yes.
Okay, so what I'm trying to explain with this slide is that we propose three different orbs, three different spokes, and a orb for this organization. But for us to do that, we need to identify some criteria. And the criteria that we used are ones, their sourcing strategy. We look at where their products, the tools, and the equipment are coming from. We look at their capacity, both internal and external capacity, and we look at their inventory, how they can better manage their inventory. So based on this criteria, we revise the service operation and we design two spokes and a hub. So that will be effective and efficient for them, and also it will allow them to reduce their carbon emissions effectively. So having proposed that model for the organization, we look at the next stage in the organization and how they can effectively meet net zero carbon emission targets. So we look at their tools and equipment attributes, what they are offering their customers. We look at their logistics system, their transport system, that is the mode of delivery. We look at the buildings attributes, both urban spokes. We look at the energy use, water use, and the amount of waste they are generating every day, every week, and every month. We look at how they manage their inventory or how they can better manage their inventory. You don't want to use physical inventory or e-inventory. Also, we look at the tool use behavior, the duration of use, and projects that users are using the tool for. And also, we try to collect data on tools performance and maintenance. So for us to do this, we need to design a carbon calculator for this organization. This carbon calculator will be e-based and will be based on these areas that have identified, all these decarbonization levels that we've identified. And that will give us an opportunity to design this carbon calculator, and that will be integrated into their website. So this is the next stage of the project and is the follow-on to the project that we just concluded. And that will give the organization an opportunity to utilize the power of technology to manage their carbon emission and report their carbon emission effectively. So based on what we can offer different organizations at Robert Gordon University and specifically at Aberdeen Business School, we have different expertise in different areas, especially in operations management, supply chain management, procurement and purchasing, logistics, business and innovation management, and most importantly, project and risk management. So we have the capability to do KTP, to do consultancy services, and I believe Neil will emphasize further on that. But this is just to tell you about some of our capabilities at Robert Gordon University. So thank you very much for listening, and Neil will take over from here.
Thanks so much, Adekunle. And as you can see there, Adekunle and Yomi's contact details are just up on the screen there. If you would like to get in contact with them about anything in this presentation, any questions that we don't cover, or anything around this Scope 3 emissions discussion that we've had so far. So I think what we'll do now is we'll just lead on to, we have some time for some follow-up Q&A sessions. So if you do have any burning questions, please do pop them into the Q&A function at the bottom. I'll invite Yomi to join us back again on screen, sort of to start discussions about the questions. So just while sort of the attendees get a chance to pop some questions into the function at the bottom, I just wanted to maybe start off with a couple of things. So thank you again for the presentation. I noticed that a lot of the solutions, the focus was on supply chain collaboration. Now, I know through my discussions with companies in the past, they've often found that there's difficulty really trying to get people to be transparent and maybe, be really open with, people throughout the supply chain. Potentially could be working with, in some aspects, competitors throughout the supply chain. How do you incentivize people to be more collaborative through the supply chain?
Thank you very much, Neil. Supply chain collaboration is quite important, not only for carbon emissions, but also for organizations to achieve competitive advantage. So to collaborate effectively, traditionally, organization has been using a arm's length relationship, but that is not sustainable. And that is due with the level of trust across supply chain. And it's ridiculous that organizations see themselves as competitors rather than collaborators. But it is supply chain that compete and not organizations. So the approach they can use is to install trust. If there's some level of trust across the supply chain, and they see that rather than creating profit for individual organizations, they're actually creating supply chain surplus across the entire supply chain. So that will allow them to collaborate effectively. And also, they can use Gradic metrics or Pareto analysis to prioritize their suppliers based on their operations and products they are offering. And that will allow them to collaborate effectively. And most importantly, they can use technology as well.
Fantastic. So is it what technology do you think is readily available at the moment that's be of use, or where do you think there needs to be sort of these technological developments that can support the supply chain?
Yeah, thank you. In recent years, there's been increasing interest in digital technology. We have Internet of Things that allow organizations to collaborate effectively, and that allows organizations to use what we call a system thinking approach or ecosystem approach. By using ecosystem approach, they can use blockchain technology, though the research is still at the rudimentary level. So they can use blockchain technology. When they talk about blockchain, many people look at it from cryptocurrency perspective, but blockchain is more than cryptocurrency. So with blockchain, they can collaborate effectively.
Thanks for that. Yomi, is there anything you'd like to?
Well, okay, just in along the line of what Adekunle has said so far about collaboration. Yes, in practice, collaboration is very, very difficult to do, especially when you have suppliers within the chain seeing each other as competitors as opposed to as collaborators. So I think one thing they need to clearly establish is getting clear what they intend to achieve. By the time they are able to achieve a clear objectives, have the same focus. He mentioned something about having supply chain vision. If our vision is the same, it will be clearer for us to collaborate, because the benefits you tend to gain, it's higher than when you tend to compete with one another. And again, if you could look at it from the transparency aspect of it, this is not something you build just in a day. He mentioned something about arm's length. It has to be a long-term relationship. So if you looking at it from building a long-term relationship with your suppliers, that gives them the opportunity. It's not a one-off business. We intend to work with you for the next 5-10 years. With that, you can start building the trust. If I have in mind that my suppliers are working with me for another 5-10 years, nothing stops me from sharing information with them. But if you are such a supplier that wants to do a one-off business, I wouldn't want to do that, because I'm selling out my competitive ability. So the transparency as well, we need to build along for you to ensure effective collaboration.
I think it's an interesting point there. We've got a really good question coming from Ellen Delph. So there are many variances on measuring scope 3. Where do you start? If and when this becomes mandatory for businesses to record the process, surely needs to be simplified to ensure the emissions are not being measured twice.
Thank you very much for that brilliant question. The starting point is to have feasibility in your supply chain. If your supply chain is feasible, it will be much easier. And two, you need to have a common accounting procedure. And what you can do for your suppliers is to register with CDP, which is Carbon Disclosure Project. So if you are using the common framework, you will eradicate the problem of double accounting.
I think,
and just to add to that, I think Adekunle have summarized everything. But what I would just like to add is organizations need to actually understand what scope 3 means. What an individual organization considers as 1 and 2 to itself is scope 3 from another organization. So by the time you clearly understand that, you won't have to double record it. And again, we're still talking about looking at your supply chain now. If you have good relationship, there is good sharing of information, there is transparency, those things will not happen.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I think going back to it, it really does touch upon the need for collaboration throughout the supply chain, but also the need for sort of a level of standardization of how it's measured. And obviously, you've mentioned a couple of the processes there, and the common methods, and using that, hopefully that can avoid the measuring being occurring twice. And you touched, Adekunle, on the really interesting concept of library of things, and I know it's something that we've spoken about quite a bit at length before, and it's an interest of yours. What other sectors do you think it would be applicable to? So you gave the project example there. Just quite interested in your thoughts on what other sectors you think that there's a real apparent sort of opportunity for them to make use of that.
Make use of
the library of things concept.
Oh, all right. Thank you very much. It's not specific to any sector or industry. Any sector can adopt it. The idea is to create an ecosystem. If you look at the oil and gas sector, they have the same suppliers, they have the same operations. They can create an ecosystem and then share resources, information, materials within that ecosystem. If you go to the food and drink sector, they can do the same thing. Operations are mostly similar, suppliers are mostly similar, so they can transfer resources from point A to point B without actually over-consume the resources. So the idea, for example, in the fashion industry, they are using the idea at the moment, the library of things concept. So any industry can use it. It's applicable to any industrial sector.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Yomi, I want to come to yourself for this next question, because I know it's something that we are interested in, sort of waste management and developing that correctly. So Adekunle alluded to the sort of mixed definitions that can sometimes be confusing around what circular economy and circularity actually means. But from your perspective, what does that actually mean for a company to be circular?
Well, being circular, it's to put in a simple way, is to eradicate waste. In that, the concept of circular economy came into being. There is always what we call the linear economy. You use the product, after the useful life, we tend to dispose it. Well, when we talk about circular economy, this model of production and consumption involves ensuring that there is always a usefulness for a product, even when it seems it's producing a waste. We won't see it as waste, but there is always an opportunity to use it in something. We can always recycle it. So the concepts of sustainability, recycling actually fits in within circular economy. So it actually eradicate the linear economy of things, of use after useful life, dump in the waste or something. But circular economy actually cuts across that. You can always use it. The output, it will always be an input for another product.
Great, thanks for that. Adekunle, is there anything sort of additional to add there?
Yeah, I can add to this. I think Dr. Osobajo has already explained that with clarity. But that's from my own perspective, that's a narrow view that organizations are taking to address the concept of a circular economy. It's more broader than waste, preventing waste or repurposed waste. We can look at an issue of waste is quite broad, you know, is quite broad. I will look at it from solid waste, waste of energy, but what about the time we waste from taking product from one point to another? Normally, we don't account for all those. What about the resources, our human resources, the employees, key employees that we're using? Can we integrate this concept into how we recruit employees as well? So if you look at the concept of circular economy, something that we can integrate throughout the unit or functional units of our organization to ensure that our organization is sustainable. Then we can now scale that to across the supply chain. So rather than focusing on waste alone, we focus on entire resources. So it has to do with how we consume resources, how we process resources, how we utilize resources.
Yeah, it's really interesting concept there. So it's not even just about sort of product service, but even the wider business operations and everything linked to that. So thank you both for that answers. So I wanted to go back to one thing. So, for example, if you're a company who has a desire to start calculating their scope 3 emissions, what would you recommend as their starting point?
Gathering the data, you need to gather the data. If you don't have access to a real-time data, there is no way you could calculate. So I would say from my own point of view, having access to real-time data about yourself, well, depending on the scope emission you are gathering, if it's scope 1, 2, those are easily gathered. But when it comes to scope 3, based on our discussion so far, you need to be aware of what is going on in your value chain or supply chain. So you need to have access to all those real-time information, real-time data, having access to those data. So again, it's always going back to your ability to obviously influence, if you don't want to use the word collaboration again, because we've used it over time now. If you can't influence your supply chain, the players in your supply chain, there is no way you could actually get the information. If the information is not there, there is no way you could calculate. So I would say it's just a retrospective information. So you need to get the real life information before you can even start calculating it.
And also to add to that, information is quite key when it comes to supply chain, and is one of the bedrocks of or driver of supply chain. So if you look at it, if you understand your operations properly, understand your suppliers, who your suppliers are. So which means you have to map your suppliers. If you identify your suppliers, what they are supplying to your operations, what they are contributing to your operations, where your suppliers are located, that is the starting point. If you understand your suppliers effectively, because like we mentioned before, the scope 1 and scope 2 of your suppliers will automatically be your scope 3. So if you understand your suppliers and their operations, then you'll be able to map your scope 3 effectively. But the starting point is to understand your suppliers.
Thank you for that. So just the final point I want to make, unless there's any other Q&A topics that come in from the audience. You put up the carbon calculator there on the screen, and I think what people are looking for is simplicity. How simple is it to develop sort of an internal carbon calculation?
It is not difficult to design, but because it involves technology, it involves machine learning. So it needs data to train the calculator so the calculator can understand what you are processing. It's not something that you enter data manually. So it involves different technology as well. And if anyone is interested in that approach, we can discuss that further and see how we can develop a simple carbon calculator for that organization.
Great, thanks so much. So I think that probably takes us to the end the webinar today. So I just want to say a really big thank you to both yourself, Yomi, and Adekunle, and really interesting presentations there. I think take away from it about collaboration, technology, the need for transparency and data, really interesting, and some more topics to go away and consider, I'm sure. So thanks everyone else for joining us today. If you do have any questions or wish to contact us after the event, just get in touch with us. We're really happy, as Adekunle and Yomi have both mentioned. We're keen to discuss with companies, businesses, any third sector organisations about how we can support this. We've got real eagerness within the university to support the economy on this. And so this webinar has been recorded and it will be available shortly on the RGU website. And the only final thing to say is just thanks again and enjoy the rest of your day.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Do have a nice day.